The $80 million yacht called the Aurelia sat dead in the water at Newport Harbor, while 50 specialists in white uniforms had tried every diagnostic tool available and still couldn't start her. CEO Celeste Mercer was furious enough to threaten canceling the entire technical team's contracts on the spot. Then Nash Holloway, a single father in an oil-stained jacket, walked up and asked to borrow a hairpin. The entire deck laughed. But 3 minutes later, when the main engine roared to life, the laughter stopped. Because Nash had just uncovered a secret that no one on that dock had been willing to say out loud. If you enjoy technical reversals that leave the powerful speechless, stay until the very last moment of this story. The Aurelia was not simply a yacht. She was a statement. 112 feet of brushed aluminum, teak decking, and satellite-linked navigation systems built to the exacting specifications of a woman who had never once accepted second best. Celeste Mercer had spent 3 years commissioning her, selecting every detail from the helm chairs to the hand-cut crystal decanters in the owner's salon. The vessel was insured for $80 million. But the number Celeste cared about far more was $600 million, the value of the coastal resort development deal she intended to close aboard the Aurelia in less than 8 hours. Her guests, 12 investors representing sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, and 2 of the largest hospitality groups in North America, were confirmed and arriving. The catering team had been aboard since dawn. At 6:47 in the morning, 4 hours before the scheduled departure, a crew member attempted to run the engine warm-up sequence. The console lit up normally, the ignition sequence initiated, and then nothing. A single soft click, barely audible over the harbor sounds, and then complete silence from the engine room. He tried again, the same click, the same silence. He checked the fuel gauges, which read full. He checked the battery indicator, which showed a complete charge. He ran the onboard diagnostic program, which displayed no fault codes. Everything appeared to be in order, and yet the engine refused to start. By 7:15, the yacht's captain, Gerald Watts, had run his own checks: backup ignition relay, shore power connections, auxiliary start system, and arrived at the same conclusion. The yacht appeared fully operational by every readable measure, and yet she would not move. The sound each start attempt produced was identical: a short, clipped click, and then nothing. Not a cough, not a failed turnover, not even a relay chatter. Just the click and silence, as though the engine had been told very firmly that it was not permitted to run. Celeste arrived at the dock at 7:22 in a charcoal jacket, and an expression her staff recognized as the prelude to consequences. She did not raise her voice. She never did. But the edge in her words when she addressed Captain Watts made several crew members take a careful step backward. This was not a mechanical inconvenience. This was the potential unraveling of a deal that had taken 14 months to structure, involving investors who had previously walked from opportunities the moment they sensed operational disorder. Celeste did not intend to give them that impression. By 8 o'clock, she had placed a call to Sterling Quinn, director of the marine engineering firm that handled all maintenance for the Mercer Atlantic Group fleet. She told him the situation, the timeline, and the consequences she expected. Sterling assured her he would have 50 of the most qualified marine technicians in the Northeast there within the hour. Celeste said she didn't care how many he brought, only that the engine was running by 11. She ended the call without waiting for his acknowledgement, then turned back toward the Aurelia, whose gleaming hull reflected the pale morning light off the water, as if entirely unaware of the crisis it had created. Sterling Quinn arrived at 8:53 with a convoy of white vans and 47 technicians, joined shortly after by 3 specialists pulled from a job in Providence. They fanned out across the Aurelia with the precision of a practiced operation, each team assigned to a specific system, each carrying diagnostic equipment that cost more individually than most working boats in the harbor. Within 20 minutes, the engine room, electrical bay, control console, and fuel management system had all been placed under active examination. Sterling stood at the center like a conductor, relaying updates through a headset, understanding that appearances mattered as much as results. By 10 o'clock, the results were uniformly baffling. The diagnostic scanners showed no engine fault codes. The fuel injectors were clean and correctly seated. The electrical relays were functioning within tolerance. The battery banks read full charge. The ignition system passed every automated check that modern marine diagnostic software could produce. And yet every time a technician attempted to start the main engine, the result was identical. One click and silence. One man spent 45 minutes tracing every wire in the ignition harness, looking for an intermittent short. He found nothing. Another dismantled the secondary start relay completely, inspected each component under a lighted magnifier, reassembled it precisely, and tried again. One click. Silent. The pattern was more disorienting than obvious failure. An engine that backfires or throws a fault code has a direction. An engine that produces a single flat click and then does nothing suggests something is preventing the start command entirely. But every pathway they could identify was open, every connection live, every testable component passing. It was as though the order to start was being issued, received, and quietly refused. At 10:30, Sterling convened his senior technicians and arrived at a conclusion he did not welcome. The most probable explanation was a failure deep within the integrated control module, the processor managing communication between the ignition system, engine management unit, and the yacht's broader electrical network. Locating a fault inside that module would require disassembly of the primary control stack, a process typically taking between 5 and 7 days in a fully equipped facility. He brought this to Celeste at 10:48. She stared at him and told him 5 to 7 days was not an answer she was prepared to accept. He told her that without disassembly, he could not make any guarantee. She turned and walked to the far rail of the dock and stood with her back to everything, looking out at the flat gray water, and did not look back. Nash Holloway had been at the harbor since 5:45. Before most of the marina staff, his 12-year-old pickup parked near the fuel dock with a toolbox in the bed and a thermos of coffee on the seat. The job that morning was a diesel generator on a commercial trawler, whose owner had already rescheduled twice. Nash didn't take that kind of pressure personally. He arrived early, worked methodically, and fixed what needed fixing. He was 3 hours into the generator job when the white vans arrived at the far end of the dock. He paid them no particular attention, but when the Aurelia's crew attempted another engine start at 9:15 and produced that same flat click, audible even from where Nash was crouched over the generator housing, he paused. He set down his wrench. He listened. They tried again. Same sound. He tilted his head slightly, the way a person does when something familiar surfaces unexpectedly in the wrong context. Rudy Callahan, a retired harbor worker who had known Nash for 6 years, called over that they'd had 50 specialists over there all morning and still couldn't get the yacht started. Some big money event, he said, grinning. And if Nash could fix it, he'd be the talk of the whole harbor for a week. Nash didn't answer. He was still listening to the pattern of attempts from the Aurelia, the intervals between them, the consistency of the sound, the absence of anything suggesting the engine was even trying to turn. He finished the generator repair, logged the parts, drank the rest of his coffee. Then he walked over to the dock where the white vans were parked. Not to offer his services, but because two of Sterling's technicians had pulled open an access panel on the port hull and were discussing removing a component he could see from 15 feet away was not the problem. He felt the particular discomfort of watching someone about to cut into the wrong wall to find a leak. He walked up alongside them and said, in a conversational tone, that they might want to hold off on that component before listening to the startup cycle one more time. One of the technicians looked at him, then at the diesel grease on his jacket and the faded logo from a marine supply company that had closed 4 years ago. The technician looked back at his colleague. Nash waited. The technician's reaction was a half shrug directed at his colleague, an unspoken communication that required no translation. Within 2 minutes, Sterling Quinn had been informed that a harbor worker was attempting to advise his team on diagnostic methodology. Sterling walked over with the measured pace of someone who considers an interruption beneath him, but feels obligated to address it personally. He assessed Nash the way certain people assess things that have appeared somewhere they don't belong, not with hostility exactly, but with the reading of clothing, posture, and context that arrives at a conclusion before a single word is spoken. He asked Nash, with the polite interest of someone who expects the answer not to matter, what his background was. Nash said he worked on marine diesels. Sterling asked what kind. Nash said anything that ran on a hull. Sterling said, with the same measured courtesy, that the Aurelia ran on a fully integrated triple-redundant propulsion management system requiring specialized training and equipment not found in the general service sector. Celeste had been watching from the aft section of the dock. She walked over, took in Nash's jacket and work boots, and her expression settled into the polite blankness she used when an unexpected variable appeared in a situation she preferred to control. She said the situation was being managed. Nash said he understood and that he wasn't trying to interfere. Only that the sound the yacht was making didn't match the failure mode they were treating it for. The click wasn't coming from the engine. It was coming from something between the ignition command and the engine itself. Something that wasn't in their diagnostic checklist. Sterling asked Nash directly, in front of the assembled technicians and in front of Celeste, what tool or approach he had in mind. Nash said he needed access to the hull near the secondary control bay and quiet during a start attempt. Sterling asked what equipment he planned to use. Nash said, almost as an aside, that a hairpin would probably do it. He was thinking practically about reaching a space behind the secondary locking panel. The reaction on the dock was immediate. Several technicians exchanged glances. One made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but served the same purpose. Sterling allowed himself a small, dry smile and said that an $80 million propulsion failure was not typically remedied with items from a lady's handbag. Celeste did not smile, but something in her posture indicated she had already moved Nash into a category that didn't require further engagement. Nash did not react to any of it. He simply waited for the noise to settle, then asked again for access to the hull panel and 3 minutes of quiet. There was a pause. Sterling looked at Celeste. On the basis of what she would later describe as nothing more than a decision to eliminate the distraction, she told him he had 2 minutes. There had been a time when Nash Holloway's name carried weight in a different kind of room. He had spent 11 years as a marine systems engineer specializing in high-specification luxury vessels, work that took him from Newport to Monaco, diagnosing and repairing propulsion and control systems on yachts whose owners measured downtime in ways most people couldn't imagine. He had been good at it the way some people are good at a language they were born hearing. Not through rote learning, but through an intuitive grasp of how systems communicated with themselves, where tension accumulated, what a sound meant when it arrived a fraction of a second off its normal cadence. He had left that world not because he burned out, but because he had discovered something he wasn't willing to pretend he hadn't seen. Contracted to assess a maintenance job on a private vessel, he had been shown an invoice for complete propulsion overhaul, new high-specification injectors, marine-grade control relays, proprietary pressure sensors throughout, all listed by part number and priced accordingly. He ran the system and knew within the first hour that several supposedly replaced components behaved exactly the way worn originals behaved. He pulled one injector. The casting marks indicated it had been manufactured 4 years before the model of engine it had been installed and even existed. The parts invoiced were not the parts installed. He documented everything clearly and reported it to management. Within 3 days, the company's legal team had characterized his report as a breach of confidentiality and potential defamation of a business partner. The vessel's owner declined to support him, explaining quietly that going public would damage a commercial relationship he couldn't afford to lose. Nash was dismissed. 2 months later, when he sought new work, a version of the story had preceded him, one in which he had disrupted a maintenance operation and caused significant delay. No one said he was lying. They simply stopped calling. He came back to Newport because it was the harbor he knew best, and because income from small repair work, fishing boats, charter vessels, the occasional pleasure craft whose owner wanted honest assessment without a premium invoice, was enough to manage on. His daughter was 6 at the time. Her mother had died when she was 2, and Nash had decided quietly that what he owed her most was his presence, steady, predictable, unhurried. Working on simpler machinery had only sharpened his listening. When you couldn't rely on expensive diagnostic equipment, you learned to rely on the machine itself, on what it was telling you when it thought no one was paying attention. Nash had always paid attention. He crouched near the hull access panel and asked the technicians to move back, not far, just far enough that their equipment and conversation would stop layering over the sounds inside the hull. He asked for complete silence for 90 seconds. Sterling gave a small nod that was more tolerance than agreement, and the technicians complied. Nash placed one hand flat against the outer hull, just above the lower frame of the access panel, and closed his eyes. He had always done this, not for performance, but because vision competes with hearing when both are active, and what he needed to hear was faint. He asked Captain Watts to initiate the start sequence. The console indicators ran through their pre-start routine: fuel pressure, oil temperature, battery verification, all normal. Then the start command was issued. The click came, and Nash heard it differently than everyone else on that dock had been hearing it. They had heard it as a final sound, a starter relay attempting to engage and failing. He heard it as a sound with a location. It was not centered in the engine room. It was displaced, offset to the left and slightly forward of the main engine housing, toward the secondary control bay along the interior port side of the hull. More specifically, it was coming from somewhere behind the auxiliary ignition lockout panel, a piece of hardware that in normal operation did nothing perceptible at all. He asked Watts to try again, this time pressing his palm against a section of hull covered on the inside by a composite panel the technicians hadn't opened because it wasn't in their diagnostic sequence. The start was initiated. The click came. Nash's hand registered the faintest vibration, not in the direction of the engine, but toward the lockout panel. He took his hand away and turned to face Sterling. He said the engine wasn't failing to start. The engine was being told not to start. The click was a mechanical safety latch, part of a secondary anti-theft lockout built into the vessel's ignition architecture, a system most diagnostic tools didn't interface with directly because it was designed to be invisible to electronic interrogation. A physical stop on the start command circuit, positioned where specific knowledge of the design was required to find it. The latch appeared to be stuck in the locked position, and every start attempt the team had made for the past several hours had been trying to push electrical power through a circuit physically interrupted. Not by a fault, not by wear, but by a stuck mechanical stop less than 3 centimeters long. 2 of Sterling's senior technicians were already pulling up system schematics on their tablets. The component Nash had described was not in the primary diagnostic checklist, not in the secondary checklist, and was found only in an appendix of the original build specification, a document Sterling's team had not accessed because it predated the current diagnostic protocol by 12 years. The secondary anti-theft lockout on the Aurelia had been designed to be invisible precisely because it was mechanical rather than electronic. The latch itself was a small, hardened steel stop seated inside a narrow channel behind the auxiliary ignition panel. In normal operation, a low-voltage solenoid retracted the stop when ignition was authorized, the start circuit completed, and the stop returned to its seat once the engine was running. The whole action taking less than 1/10 of a second, leaving no indication the system had done anything at all. The channel housing the stop was recessed in a space approximately 11 millimeters wide and 42 millimeters deep, designed deliberately so the stop could not be accessed from the main engine room or the primary console. Too narrow for any standard tool from a marine service kit, the design assumed the stop would never need manual access, because the solenoid would handle retraction during normal operation. What the design had not fully accounted for was the possibility that the stop could become jammed in the locked position, whether through debris, corrosion, or something more deliberate, and leave a technician with no electronic path to release it and no obvious mechanical path either. Nash explained this in straightforward terms, without technical flourish. The right tool needed to be thin enough to fit the gap, flexible enough to navigate the angle of the channel, and rigid enough to apply lateral pressure on the stop. He said that a hairpin, if someone had one, would be close to the right profile. A young woman in the Aurelia's service crew, Laurel Hayes, who had been watching the morning's events with the focused attention of someone who learns by watching, reached into her jacket pocket and produced a hairpin without a word. Nash took it, assessed the width, and bent the outer arm to approximately 30 degrees using his thumbnail. He said it would work. Sterling said that modifying the safety architecture of an $80 million yacht with a piece of a woman's hair accessory was not a procedure he was prepared to authorize. Nash said he wasn't asking for authorization. He was going to insert the modified pin into the access gap, locate the stuck stop by feel, and apply lateral pressure to shift it back to its open position. If it worked, the solenoid would engage normally on the next attempt. If it didn't, nothing would have changed. Sterling turned to Celeste. Her expression had shifted, not to belief, not yet, but to the particular quality of attention that appears in a person who has decided, against their preference, that they cannot rule something out. She gave a single nod. Nash knelt at the access panel and worked without ceremony, moving with the patience of someone who had done fine work in tight spaces for most of his professional life. He felt the stop within 15 seconds, slightly displaced from its seat, canted at a small angle invisible to any external inspection. He applied steady lateral pressure with the pin, and after approximately 8 seconds, felt the stop shift. He withdrew the pin and stood. He turned to Captain Watts on the bridge wing and said, with no particular drama, that they could try the engine again. Watts looked at Sterling. Sterling looked at Celeste. There was a beat, the kind of pause that forms when an unlikely outcome is on the edge of resolving, and then Celeste said to try it. The pre-start indicators ran their sequence. Fuel pressure nominal, oil temperature nominal, battery voltage nominal, everything exactly as it had been every other time that morning, and then Watts pressed the start command. There was no click. There was the fractional pause that comes when something blocked finally clears, followed by an engagement different in character from anything the doc had heard all morning. The starter relay engaged with a clean, full sound, the fuel injectors primed, and then the main engine of the Aurelia turned over and roared to life. The hull shook. The water around the stern disturbed. The exhaust outlets cleared to the heavy, even throb of a large diesel running at idle. For 3 full seconds, no one on the dock said anything. The technicians were still. Sterling Quinn did not move. Celeste stood with her hands clasped, and her face moved through several expressions quickly enough that no single one settled. The diagnostic console on the bridge showed all systems green. Nash straightened and handed the bent hairpin back to Laurel Hayes. Laurel took it with both hands and the slightly wide eyes of someone experiencing a specific kind of morning for the first time. Celeste asked how he had known where to listen. Nash said the click wasn't the right shape for a starter fault. A bad relay clicks differently. A failed solenoid clicks differently. This sound had a mechanical quality, a stop engaging against a stop, rather than the electrical character of a circuit fault. Once you knew what you were listening for, the location was apparent. Sterling recovered enough composure to say that Nash's intervention had been unverified and risky, and that he still recommended full disassembly for safety. Nash said quietly that the recommendation would remove the only physical evidence of what had happened to the latch, that the condition of the stop was worth examining before anyone touched it. He said it not as an accusation, but as a statement of professional completeness. Then he stepped back and said, to no one in particular, the engine wasn't broken. Someone convinced it that it wasn't supposed to run. He was speaking technically about the lockout, the stop, the nature of the fault, but the words landed on the dock in the particular silence that follows an engine coming back from the dead and carried a meaning that reached beyond the mechanical. Celeste heard it, Watts heard it. Even Sterling heard it, though he spent the next 40 minutes trying to determine what it meant in ways that did not implicate him. Nash did not leave. Something about the condition of the stop nagged at him in the way that small discrepancies nag at people who have learned that small discrepancies are rarely random. He asked Watts for permission to examine the latch more closely before the panel was closed, and Watts said to go ahead. He used a slim flashlight to illuminate the channel and examined the stop and its seating surface with patient focus. Corrosion-related jamming produces pitting and irregular discoloration. Debris-related jamming produces particulate evidence in the channel. What Nash was looking at was a stop clean on its resting surfaces, but showing a subtle, uniform score along its lateral face. The kind of mark that comes from something pressed deliberately against a machined surface at a consistent angle. The stop hadn't drifted out of position. It had been nudged. Carefully, with knowledge of the geometry, and with the minimal force that leaves only the faintest trace. He took 2 photographs with his phone, then found Whitney Boone near the dock entrance. She had arrived to cover the signing event for a maritime business publication, and had stayed because the scene was substantially more interesting than the story she'd come for. Nash showed her the photographs and described what he'd found. The stuck latch had not reached its jammed position through any natural failure pathway, and if Sterling's team had proceeded with the disassembly they were recommending, the original components, including the latch assembly, would have been discarded, and the cause of the fault permanently eliminated from examination. Whitney asked how much the replacement would have cost. He said the scope Sterling had outlined would have started around $2 million, possibly climbing toward $4 million depending on what was actually invoiced versus actually installed. He said he didn't know for certain what parts would have been used, but he knew something about how that category of work was typically managed by firms of a certain kind. Whitney said she did too. She pulled out her phone and began making calls. Celeste walked over after the last of Whitney's calls and asked Nash directly what he believed had happened. He said the latch had been manipulated, not by accident, not by wear, but by someone with access to the vessel and specific knowledge of the lockout system's location and mechanics. That person had almost certainly known that a triggered lockout wouldn't produce fault codes, and that standard diagnostics wouldn't find it. Which meant they had also known that a firm recommending disassembly would be doing so on the basis of a problem that didn't exist, at a cost that would be very real. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she looked across the dock toward Sterling Quinn, who was directing his team in packing up equipment with a briskness that had taken on a slightly different quality over the last 15 minutes. Sterling moved to close the situation down by reframing the narrative before it had time to solidify. He circulated among his senior technicians and assembled an account in which Nash's successful restart was the product of a fortunate guess. The latch was a minor legacy component at the end of its service life, and the disassembly recommendation remained clinically sound as a precautionary measure. He brought this to Celeste at the stern of the dock with the composed confidence of a man who had delivered reassuring explanations to wealthy clients many times before. Celeste listened. What was not being said in Sterling's account was any engagement with Nash's observation about the scoring on the latch face, any acknowledgement of the photographs, or any response to the question of why disassembly was appropriate for a system that was now running correctly. She asked Sterling whether he had examined the stop component himself. He said he was satisfied with his team's assessments. She asked why he wanted to proceed with disassembly if the engine was running and no fault codes were present. He said intermittent failures in high-value systems were common, and the responsible course was full module replacement. Nash had come over during this exchange and stood at the edge of it without inserting himself. He said that full replacement of the auxiliary control stack would require removal of the latch assembly, and that the latch assembly was the only remaining physical record of how the fault had been created. He said it to the space between Sterling and Celeste in the tone of someone making a practical observation. Sterling turned toward him. The politeness deployed earlier in the morning was no longer operative. He told Nash he was a harbor worker who had been allowed to insert a piece of bent wire into a yacht he had no credentials to service, and that a fortunate outcome did not constitute a professional assessment or a basis for impugning the work of a licensed and insured firm. He said Nash's continued involvement was not appropriate, and that he would be asking him to leave. Nash said he would leave whenever Celeste asked him to. Sterling looked at Celeste. She was looking at the photographs on Nash's phone, which Nash had handed her without comment. The images were clear, the undisturbed surfaces of the stop's resting faces, and the precise lateral score that didn't belong there. She zoomed in on the second image, handed the phone back, and told Sterling to hold off on any further work on the system until she had completed a review. Sterling started to reply. She said she would let him know when the review was complete. Sterling adjusted his clipboard under his arm and walked toward the bow section of the dock, where he stood with his back to the group and placed a call that no one on the dock could hear. Nash had known of Gideon Hart for years without dealing with him directly. One of a diminishing group of marine engineers who had worked in the era when high-specification vessels were built by hand and the documentation was created by the same people who designed the systems. Hart was 81 years old and had officially retired a decade prior, but he still answered the phone when people called with questions that mattered. Nash called him from the dock at 11:40. He described the lockout system, the latch location, the access gap dimensions, the scoring on the stop face, and what he had done to release it. Hart was quiet during all of it, the focused quiet of someone listening closely rather than waiting to respond. When Nash finished, Hart asked two questions: the gap dimension at the secondary panel, and whether the scoring on the latch face ran perpendicular or parallel to the long axis of the stop. Nash told him. Hart was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "You were right." He said the lockout system on the Aurelia was one of the last of its kind, an entirely passive mechanical override specified at the original owner's request as a secondary layer of anti-theft protection independent of all electronic systems. The design logic was that any electronic security could in principle be defeated electronically, but a physical stop in an inaccessible location that produced no digital signature could not be found or overridden by any software-based intrusion. The system had been built with one deliberate drawback acknowledged at design. If the stop ever jammed in the locked position, restoring it would require knowledge not included in any standard service manual. The assumption had been that this would never happen through normal use. That assumption had, apparently, been tested. Hart said the number of people who knew where that latch was located could be counted on two hands. The build documentation resided in the archives of the naval architecture firm that had designed the vessel, not in any maintenance manual a standard marine engineering firm would possess. Whoever had accessed it would have needed either direct contact with that archive or first-hand knowledge from having worked on the system itself. Then he said that if Nash had diagnosed the fault by sound, identifying the click as mechanical rather than electrical, locating it by touch and listening rather than by any instrument, then Nash understood the system better than many people paid specifically to understand it. Not flattery, he said, a technical assessment. The diagnostic approach required a mental model of the system's architecture that couldn't be learned from a schematic alone. The familiarity that comes from years of listening to what machinery says rather than what the instruments report. That kind of competency was increasingly rare in an industry that had come to rely on diagnostic equipment as a substitute for understanding. Nash thanked him, and after the call ended, stood on the dock for a moment before walking back toward where Whitney Boone was waiting. Whitney Boone had spent 9 years covering the luxury maritime industry for a publication whose readership was small, wealthy, and attentive to the costs of poor information. She had developed a secondary specialty in the financial structures of marine service contracts, the gap between what was invoiced and what was necessary. She had written 2 pieces that resulted in regulatory inquiries, and she maintained a mental files on several companies whose billing patterns she tracked with the patient interest of someone who expected, eventually, to write a third. Sterling Quinn's firm was in that file. Nothing conclusive, no formally resolved complaint. But there was a pattern. A client brings in a vessel with a problem. The firm identifies a systemic failure requiring complete module replacement. The replacement is performed at considerable cost. The original components are discarded as part of the procedure, and the vessel runs after the work, confirming to everyone's satisfaction that the diagnosis was correct. The question of whether something simpler would have worked never gets asked, because the simpler thing was never tried and the evidence no longer exists. Whitney had spoken with 3 yacht owners over the previous 2 years who described nearly identical experiences with firms sharing key structural characteristics with Sterling's operation, exclusive service agreements, diagnostic protocols that consistently identified module-level failures, and invoice structures combining parts and labor in ways that made line-item review difficult. In 2 of those cases, owners had later been told by independent engineers that the repairs were substantially more extensive than the underlying problem required. The owners had paid between $1.5 and $3 million each. The morning on the Aurelia had given Whitney something she had been missing, a live case documented in real time in which a faulty diagnosis had been contradicted by an independent intervention before the unnecessary work could be performed. She had Nash's photographs, the full timeline, the cost range Sterling had quoted, and the information from Gideon Hart about the rarity of knowledge required to have placed the latch in its jammed position. By the time the Aurelia's departure had been confirmed for early afternoon, she had built the beginning of a structural case. Not yet publishable, but coherent enough that when she found Nash near his truck, she told him that what he had found that morning was not the first time, and almost certainly would not have been the last if things had gone the way Sterling intended. Celeste Mercer had not reached the position she occupied, CEO of a real estate and development group managing $8 billion in assets across 3 continents. By being slow to recognize when she had been wrong, she had made enough significant errors to develop a clear process, acknowledge the facts, assess the damage, decide on the response, and move. What made the situation on the dock unusual was not the error itself. She had trusted an expert who had failed, which was a risk with experts, but the manner of the correction. She had dismissed Nash Holloway within 30 seconds of seeing him. Not cruelly, not with intention, but with the reflexive efficiency of someone who processes people's relevance quickly and moves on. She understood now that this was exactly the kind of rapid assessment that had likely been intended by whoever had arranged for Sterling's team to be the only people seriously consulted. She spoke with Whitney for 40 minutes in the owner's salon. Whitney laid out what she had found and what she was pursuing. Celeste listened without interruption, and when Whitney finished, said she would cooperate with the investigation and instruct her general counsel to preserve all service records, invoices, and communications with Sterling's firm going back 4 years across the entire fleet. She then asked Nash to come aboard. He was sitting on the stern steps when she found him, not waiting, just not having left yet. She sat down a step above him, which put them at approximately the same height, and told him directly that she had handled the morning badly and owed him an apology. He said she had made a reasonable judgment based on what was in front of her. She said what was in front of her should have included the possibility that the most qualified person at the dock might not be wearing a uniform. She said she meant it as an acknowledgement, not a compliment. He said he understood the difference. She said she could manage the story quietly, absorb the cost, let Nash leave the dock without acknowledgement, or she could let it land the way it was going to land. Nash said he didn't need acknowledgement. The thing he cared about was whether the same play would be run on another client's vessel next month, because now he understood clearly how the scheme worked and where it was vulnerable. Whatever she decided publicly was her choice. The part that mattered was what happened to the service relationship and the evidence. Celeste said she had already decided that part. She looked at the Aurelia's hull, listening to the low idle of the engine Nash had restored, and said that she sometimes confused the cost of a thing with its quality, and that the morning had been an efficient correction of that confusion. Then they walked back up to the deck together. The Aurelia departed Newport Harbor at 2:14 in the afternoon. Behind schedule by more than 3 hours but ahead of the hard deadline Celeste had set, with guests accommodated in the salon with chilled wine, and the explanation that a technical matter had been addressed with unusual efficiency. The guests took this with the well-practiced tolerance of people whose own operations had occasionally required similar language. Sterling Quinn had remained on the dock during preparations, finding reasons to be present. Nash watched from near the stern steps without comment. Laurel Hayes offered Nash a coffee, and the two stood together for a while in the silence of people who have witnessed something that requires time to settle. The event began on the water 2 miles off the Newport coast, with the Rhode Island shore visible to the west in the afternoon light and the engine of the Aurelia running with the easy, steady authority of a system that had been given permission to do its job. Celeste moved through the salon greeting guests with composed ease. The catering staff worked the room. The documents were arranged on the main table for signing. Everything appeared, from the outside, to have proceeded exactly as planned. Sterling had come aboard for the departure, and he circulated near the bar for the first 40 minutes with the ease of a man moving through a space as though it belonged to him. Whitney had been credentialed for the event as press. She approached Celeste at the edge of the main salon, and the two women exchanged 4 quiet sentences that resulted in Celeste calling for the attention of her guests. The room settled. Celeste stood at the head of the signing table and said that before the formalities of the afternoon proceeded, she wanted to share something about the morning, not as a disruption, but as context for the kind of standards she intended to apply to the partnership they were about to formalize. She said, "The Aurelia had experienced a systems failure that morning, which had prevented departure for several hours. She said 50 qualified technicians had been unable to identify the cause. She said the cause had ultimately been identified and corrected by an independent engineer who had come aboard without a service contract and without anything other than the specific knowledge of what the system sounded like when something wasn't right." Nash was standing near the deck doorway, in the same jacket as the morning, which Whitney noticed because she noticed things. Celeste said his name, and several guests turned to look. She said the failure appeared not to be accidental, and that she had initiated a review of her maintenance contracts across the full fleet. She said this clearly and without softening it, while Sterling stood near the bar with a glass of wine and an expression that had gone carefully neutral. Whitney asked, from near the credenza, whether Sterling's firm could explain the diagnostic failure and the recommendation for disassembly of a system corrected without any replacement parts. Sterling set his glass down and began a sentence about the complexity of integrated systems and the prudence of precautionary replacement in high-value assets. He did not get far before 2 guests, one a former maritime regulator, one a fleet management executive who had used Sterling's firm on 3 of his own vessels, began asking questions that required more specific answers than Sterling had prepared. Nash was asked to explain how he had found the fault. He did so concisely, describing the sound and what it indicated, and the physical access required to correct it. He mentioned Laurel's hairpin as a matter of fact, without turning it into a performance. Several people in the room smiled. A few looked at Sterling. One guest, a woman who managed a hospitality portfolio worth considerably more than $600 million, leaned toward her colleague and said something too quiet to hear. Her colleague nodded slowly. Sterling left the salon approximately 20 minutes before the signing. The signing took place without him. Celeste stood at the head of the table and watched 12 signatures go down on 12 copies of the Coastal Development Agreement, while the Rhode Island coastline moved past the windows and the engine ran beneath them with a low, even authority Nash could hear from near the deck doors. He was not a party to the agreement. He was simply a man who had come to a boat on a Tuesday morning because the sound was wrong, and who had stayed because one thing had led to another. On the return to Newport, Celeste found him on the aft deck. The sun was lower, the water had the bronze quality it takes on in the late afternoon, and the dock was visible ahead. She told him she had instructed her general counsel to terminate the service agreement with Sterling's firm immediately, and that a formal notification to the relevant maritime oversight body would be submitted that week. She said the investigation of the fleet's historical maintenance records had begun and that she expected what Whitney's reporting would find. She said it would be addressed properly, not quietly. Then she made him an offer, an independent technical advisory arrangement for the Mercer Atlantic Group's marine assets, present at diagnostics for significant jobs, with final sign-off authority on any maintenance recommendation above a certain threshold. $200,000 a year, a flexible schedule, and a consultation rate on top of the retainer. She said she was not offering it out of obligation. She was offering it because she had spent the morning watching him work and understood that what she had been buying from Sterling's firm was the appearance of expertise, and what Nash had was the thing itself. Nash listened, then said he would consider it on 2 conditions. The first was the right to recommend against any repair, in writing, with that recommendation recorded and acted on, and not to have it overridden by a service firm's commercial interest. The second was a professional advisory arrangement, not a service contract, with no exclusivity clause limiting his ability to serve other clients. The first time he was asked to look the other way on a recommendation, the engagement would end. Celeste said both conditions were acceptable and that she expected nothing less. She then said she was sorry for the morning, not as acknowledgement, but the way someone says something when they've had several hours to understand what they mean by it. Nash said she had had no reason to think otherwise. She said that was a generous answer. He said he had grown up learning that people were usually doing the best they could with what they were looking at. Sometimes the problem wasn't the person. It was what they had been trained to see. 3 months passed. Nash kept the small shop on the north end of the harbor, the corrugated metal building with the rolling door and the smell of oil and metal that his daughter, now 7, had grown up thinking of as the place where her father went to think. He kept the trawler work and the generator repairs and the walk-in jobs from local boat owners who needed someone honest. He added the independent consultancy alongside all of it, which produced what it had promised: documented assessments. Service contractors who knew their recommendations would be checked by someone whose only interest was whether they were accurate, and a record of repairs that were stopped before they started. Whitney's piece was published 8 weeks after the morning on the dock. It covered Sterling's firm, the broader pattern she had documented across 5 similar operations in the Northeast, and the mechanism that made the fraud possible: the disposal of original components, the absence of independent verification, the economic structure of exclusive maintenance contracts on high-value assets. 2 regulatory inquiries were opened within a month of publication. 3 yacht owners filed civil complaints. Sterling's firm suspended operations pending investigation. Laurel Hayes had kept the hairpin. She had told the story enough times, the way dock staff tell stories over coffee breaks, that it had acquired the character of a small legend, the kind that harbors collect about mornings when the ordinary and the unlikely met in the same place at the same time. Nash had heard a version of the story twice, told by people who didn't know he was the person in it, and had each time let it pass without correction. The hairpin was framed eventually, a small shadow box on the wall of his shop, next to a schematic of the Aurelia's secondary lockout system that Gideon Hart had mailed to him, with handwritten annotations in the margins. There was no label on the frame. Anyone who asked, Nash would tell. Most people who came to the shop didn't ask. They came because they'd heard he was honest, or because someone else's expensive diagnosis hadn't fixed the problem, or because they needed someone who would listen to what the machine was actually saying. On a Thursday evening in early October, the Aurelia left Newport Harbor as the sun fell below the coast. The engine ran the way it had always been capable of running, steady and deep, no hesitation, no uncertainty. Celeste stood at the rail of the upper deck as the lights of the harbor receded and the open water widened ahead. She looked toward the north end of the dock, toward the corrugated building with the rolling door, and held that image for a moment before she turned to face the sea. She had spent the morning of the worst technical failure in the Aurelia's history, surrounded by 50 specialists in white uniforms, and the problem had been solved by one man with a bent hairpin and a willingness to stand still and listen. Because sometimes the answer isn't in the equipment, it's in knowing that the world keeps making sounds, if you stay quiet enough to hear them.